Okay, so the theme today is agnosticism. I thought we'd start just with a little experiential exercise, just for a very short time. So just for 20 seconds, I would like you to imagine infinity. Okay, so you could close your eyes and I'll time you for 20 seconds. Okay, 20 seconds are over. So that was a bit of a cheat because basically what I was trying to do there was just to demonstrate that you can't do it. Whatever you imagined, maybe for instance, perhaps you imagine zooming past lots of galaxies out into the vastness of space, yeah? Something like that. But that wasn't infinity. Yeah, so whatever you imagined would necessarily be finite. So our senses can't grasp anything infinite, nor can our imagination, which is sort of modelled on our senses. It depends on the central perspective. Really this tries to demonstrate the difference between a concept, something that's just a concept, and an experience of some kind, whether it's a sensual experience or an imaginary experience. So infinity is an example of a concept that can't be imagined. You just have it as an abstract concept, and it's it's only meaningful to us because it's a negation of something that's finite. We know in experience what something big finite is, but to be infinite just is a negation of that. So if something's just conceptual like that, okay, that's fine. These are very useful concepts to have, but as long as we don't start making claims about concepts that lie beyond experience, perhaps other than claims just about the relationships between concepts, which is maths, really. But beyond that, if we make claims that confuse that conceptual world with the experiential world, I think that's where trouble lies. And a lot of people seem to be in the habit of casually treating infinity as though it was just a large number. So if you think of phrases like to infinity and beyond, which is just a ridiculous thing to say. That really tells us something, I think, about absolute beliefs. So absolute beliefs have an infinite scope, and they're merely conceptual in the same way as a belief about infinity. So as a belief, say that the universe was infinite. So to bring this a bit down to earth, let me give you another couple of examples. So supposing you complain to your partner, you never do the washing up. That's washing the dishes for Americans, sorry, yes. The washing up means washing the dishes. So you never do the washing up. The never there has an infinite scope. So are you quite sure about that? Does she never do the washing up? Never is a long time, as they say, although actually it's even more than a long time. So you're effectively claiming there that never in the history of the universe has she or will she do the washing up, which is way beyond experience. Or another one, Tories are completely untrustworthy. So completely untrustworthy? You quite sure about that? There's no possibility ever of a Tory being trustworthy in any respect. Yeah, so obviously it's very tempting a lot of the time for us to create these absolute claims. So agnosticism, coming to the subject, is the avoidance of those absolute beliefs or absolute claims. and it's an aspect of the middle way, going along with the 4 other principles of the middle way, which are part of this series. So we've already had scepticism, recognizing uncertainty, provisionality, becoming aware of alternatives, so that we can change our view flexibly. We've had incrementality, which is almost like an antidote to absolutization, because we're thinking in terms of increments instead. And then the other one, which we'll have next time, is integration, which is the psychological aspect of this. But agnosticism is perhaps it's the most philosophical and critical of the 5 principles, because it's concerned with avoiding those absolute beliefs on either side. And you probably associate the phrase with debate about the existence or non-existence of God, and that's really where the term comes from. It was first used by Thomas Huxley in the 19th century in connection with the existence of God. So literally it means not knowing, and he used it of the recognition that we can neither know that God exists nor know that he doesn't exist. So yeah, that's a good example. It's recognizing that we cannot justifiably make claims about absolute infinite things, because such conceptual beliefs are in a different, a whole different ballgame. You could say they're a different kind of claim from experiential claims that lie within experience. Hence, they can't be a matter of probability. They are simply conceptual in nature. But the agnosticism can apply to a lot of other, in fact, any other absolute claim or its negation. So by agnosticism, I don't just mean a particular view of the existence of God. You could apply it, for example, to determinism versus free will, which is a very important one. Or you could apply it to Trump's belief that he's always right, versus the belief that he's never right, or the examples I just gave. So basically any absolute belief you can be agnostic about. But in the process, to be agnostic in a balanced way, you also need to avoid the opposite, equally absolute belief. So what people often miss when they're considering absolute beliefs is that denials of absolute belief also have infinite scope. So going back to infinity for a moment, unless you can get to infinity, which you can't experience what's not there any more than you can experience what is there. Negative statements are just as dodgy in relation to this sort of theoretical place, as it were, beyond experience. So it's important to be agnostic for practical reasons, so that we don't get swept up into groupthink with its shortcuts, with its absolutizations, and with its power trips. So I've talked in previous sessions about the ways that absolutes are used, shortcuts and tools of power. And also, of course, they can be psychologically repressive in our own minds, brains, mind brains. So absolute beliefs are typically enforced by ruling out the possibility of agnosticism in the whole way that things are framed. So there's a long history, just as there's a long history of the misunderstanding of skepticism in philosophy and religion and so on. There's a similar history, I think, of the attempt to either appropriate or dismiss agnosticism, and that's still going on today, I think, in the way that the subject is treated. Just to give you a quick example of that, you'll often find, if you discuss agnosticism with atheists, that they will claim that agnosticism is really a sort of atheism. You also find theists who claim that. And that goes back to a philosopher called Anthony Flew, who devised the term negative atheism, which basically defined agnosticism as a form of atheism. Now, of course, people can stipulate what they like. They can decide how to use terms. If you want to use atheism in that sense, that's something. But we need to think about the effects of doing so when we use terms in a particular way. So if you do that, then I think it reframes things so that we can't take agnosticism seriously as a genuine middle option. And so that's what I'm concerned with here, is the practical value of agnosticism. So, yeah, coming back to one of the basic principles of the middle way, which again I've talked about in previous talks in this series. The middle way is about how we judge things rather than what we judge. So when people have some sort of absolutist agenda, or when they're trying to get you back into a framework of there being two alternatives and that's it, then they're also totally concerned with what we're judging, not about how we judge it or who we are or what our experience is. So they'll always go back to whether the thing exists or not, or whether it's true or false. There's this obsession with truth or falsity, even when the truth or falsity is totally abstract and has nothing to do with our direct experience. So this kind of obsession can have a vice-like grip on our thinking, locking us into absolutes, either for or against them, and the groups that go with them. Now, just a couple of, before I finish, just a couple of qualifications to all that. So obviously I'm recommending agnosticism as an aspect of the middle way, avoiding both positive and negative absolute beliefs. But one thing to note is that we need to try and check out what people mean when they seem to be using making absolute claims of some kind. Because what people mean by words can vary, what the words mean to them. So although there may be a widely socially accepted ways of talking about absolutes, which are obviously absolutes, so if you're talking, say, to theologians in the Catholic Church, it's very likely they'll be talking in absolute terms, but that's not always the case. So sometimes, for example, somebody who talks about belief in God may actually be talking about their experience of God. It's worth sometimes investigating more closely. And the test in the end is always how they apply their belief, what the implications are. So do they think something else is absolutely justified because of their absolute belief? Then my other caveat is that believing in absolutes is distinct from the meaning of absolutes. So I think there's been a lot of confusion about this through the years, that for example, some people who didn't believe in God began to argue that God was meaningless, but that doesn't follow at all. So absolute concepts, absolute ideas and their symbols can, I think, be very helpful to us, because they can function as inspirations and reminders to help us in an integrative practice. So if you're not making claims about them, then absolute things, having that concept, having that idea of infinity or truth or God or nature or enlightenment, whatever it is, can be fine. Yeah, it's just a matter of taking care about how you use those concepts and when you start turning them into claims. And how do you tell the difference between a concept and a belief? Well, beliefs are propositional, so at least implicitly they take the form of sentences which make claims, whereas concepts are just symbols. They're just symbolic. They can stand by themselves. Okay, so I just got a very quick summary which I want to share with you, because I'm aware that it's probably what I've been saying is more complex than usual even. But so this is just a single slide just to review what I've just been saying quickly. So we have some concepts of infinite scope that can't be sensed or imagined, including infinity itself. Beliefs about these things in their normal sense are absolute beliefs, whether they're positive or negative. Some people may try to use these concepts to refer to experience. So we need to check how they use them. Absolute meaning, as opposed to belief, may be archetypal and practically inspiring. Yeah, so some of my recent work, including the books that are coming out in October and next year, explore this idea of archetypes much more fully. Then agnosticism involves avoiding both positive and negative beliefs even-handedly. Even-handedness is part of the challenge. And then finally, beware appropriations and dismissals that prevent us from thinking in agnostic terms by forcing a dualistic framework. Yeah, so if somebody says you've got the ideas all wrong, then just check that they're not actually trying to prevent you from thinking in a middle way fashion at all, because that's quite common. Okay, I better stop there. So, any questions or comments?
Robert, if you look at the Gnosticism in the Bible, would that fit with agnosticism?
Could you say more about what you mean by Gnosticism in the Bible?
Well, say that the Gospel of Thomas is known as a Gnostic Gospel. The Gospel of John is. They're very provisional, they're very spiritual in the sense that they're not as concrete. They don't understand the metaphors that, say, Christ used as absolutes. They're much more expanded. And I was just interested in your take on that.
Okay, well, I'd say that depends very much how you interpret them. So as regards the Gospel of John, I would agree with you. I'm not so familiar with the Gospel of Thomas, but with the Gospel of John, I'd agree with you that it's very rich, as long as you interpret it in a symbolic way. So I've written a bit about that in my book, The Christian Middle Way. Yeah, one needs to make a distinction between the symbols, provide the meaning of those symbols, which could be very helpful to us, and the philosophy that's imposed on them. So the Gnostic philosophy is generally Platonic and idealist. So it does have absolute beliefs involved in it. Now, how much those matter probably depends on the context and how it's being used and where it is. But I'd just suggest being careful when it comes to further discussions, implications of those texts. So always that there can be texts that inspire us and we can get an awful lot from them, but we need to have a bit of the wisdom of serpents as well as the innocence of doves in interpreting them and thinking about their implications. Great. Any other questions or thoughts?
I'm struggling to think of just everyday, sort of an everyday use for how does this sort of manifest in your experience?
Okay, well, let's go back to the everyday example I gave of accusing your partner of never doing the washing up. Yeah, well, it's an aspect of avoiding absolute claims, really. So obviously when one makes an absolute claim like that, then people are more likely to react to it because they won't be able to relate it to an experience. So there isn't a basis of agreement there based on a shared experience. So if your partner, in their experience, perhaps does the washing up occasionally, and you accuse them of never doing it, then you can get into unnecessary conflict about it. And I think so that's a little example of all the practical implications, even of the more philosophical aspects of this. You know, it has implications for conflict and how people relate to each other in different groups and so on. You know, even if it's you know, how different churches relate to each other, or other kind of political groups or whatever, depends often on whether they're capable of avoiding those absolute beliefs in the way they argue. But to really avoid the absolute beliefs rather than sort of taking them on board unawares, you know, it needs a practice of agnosticism, a bit of wariness about where absolute beliefs might be assumed.
So would you say it's sometimes just a matter of leaving? if you sort of still have those beliefs and you might still be holding on to those, perhaps just leaving them to one side and just not bringing them into the discussion.
Yeah, I agree that. I mean, leaving them to one side is one way of avoiding the framework in which the dualistic pattern is dominant, you know, where there are only two options. And sometimes that's the best way socially of avoiding getting sucked into that framework. Obviously, the other way is, if you can, is to directly challenge it or propose a positive alternative. You know, that you could think about it this other way if people are receptive enough to that.
Yeah. Okay.
But obviously, if you're stepping into a war zone or something, then you're not going to have a chance to do that. Probably, you just have to avoid that way of framing things. Barry?
Yeah, I've recently been involved in an email discussion of a similar theme that we're exploring today, and the person I was speaking to, it was emailing with, said that even if that he says, the assumption that we're finite, but even if that were to be the case, who says that there's a correlation between finitude and ability to experience or know all forms of truth? Now, I responded, but I was just be interested in hear what your response was, Robert, to that.
Well, in the end, I mean, it sounds like finiteness is then being treated just as an abstraction, but it needs to link to our embodied experience, I would say. So our experiences of being finite, as I was trying to show really through that little thought experiment, that we can't even imagine being outside something, being finite. And that's due to having a body, basically. So I'd want to bring the discussion back to the body in some sense, probably.
Yeah, well, that's basically what I just said that I would say the weight of evidence in our experience suggests that we are finite, I suppose.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, but you can only have a weight of experience if you're thinking incrementally rather than thinking in absolute.
But what about his question that, you know, that why is there necessarily a correlation between finiteness and our ability to know all forms of truth?
Well, because of the all, which has infinite scope. In what you
okay, or other forms of truth.
But even the notion of truth,
itself,
you know, has absolute scope.
Yeah.
The idea that we can have a proposition, a sentence, which expresses reality directly. And I think there's just a mistake there in the way that we understand language and its relationship to the world.
Okay, thanks.